Happy Monday, everyone, and welcome to the Religious Studies Project. We are very pleased to have you here. I'm Brianne Fallon, and I am joined by my co-editor,
Dave McConaughey.
How are you going, Dave?
I am going quite well. It's it's still winter here and it's still summer there, so it's cold here and hot for you, and both of us are probably waiting for the more mediating temperatures.
Well, there was an article in our local paper today that Australian summer is getting longer than ever. So they're predicting that it will last through to May. And for those people who are on the other side of the world, it normally ends in February. So we have
Oh dear.
months of beach weather to go.
Oh dear. Is there an equivalent to the groundhog in the United States? The groundhog comes up out of its hole, looks around to see whether it wants to continue hibernating or not, and then we get to hear whether Puxatawny Phil, that's the name of the
Oh yeah, I've seen the
whether we
movie.
get six more weeks of winter. Is there an Australian equivalent for that for winter?
Not really. I mean, we have a wombat which lives in a burrow, but I don't really think it's the same as a groundhog.
Well, that's disappointing. I think you have an opportunity here.
I'm sure I can capitalize on that in some way.
Well, all of us here have an opportunity to think about the way in which we are signaled by systems, because today we have an interview with David Robertson interviewing Timothy Fitzgerald about empty signs in an automatic signaling system. So take it away.
I'm here with Tim Fitzgerald of the University of Queensland, where he's a visiting research professor. This interview follows on from his recent interview entitled "The Problem with Religion and Related Categories." And at the end of that interview, we had talked about his fieldwork in India and his time living in Japan, and how this had led to him writing the ideology of religious studies. And central to that was an attempt to kind of pin down and locate this category, religion. Maybe you could pick the story up for us there, Tim.
Yeah, sure. I mean, one of my targets was when I was in Japan, was the religion industry, which was applied to Japan itself in the form of the study of Japanese religions, and the difficulty in actually identifying what constitutes a religion in Japan, which was also the problem about what constitutes the non-religious secular. A lot of my work was aimed at trying to show that there is this basic contradiction between the study of religion, whether that's by Japanese or non-Japanese scholars, and the actual problem of locating it. And the problem of religion is therefore the problem of the non-secular, and how we ended up with this idea that there is a religious world of the Japanese, which is somehow distinguishable from the non-religious world of the Japanese. So this led me to look historically for the source of this binary that we have in this religion-secular construction. And that led me back actually to the 17th century in England. And I started doing a lot of reading on, not only the 17th century, but going back to the 16th century. The post-Reformation discourse on religion is really what I was looking for. And what I found was that right the way through the 16th and 17th centuries, and I think that this is true going right the way through into the 18th and 19th and possibly up to the present in certain respects, is that the dominant meaning of religion was our Protestant faith. And it was a male literate construct of our Protestant faith. In a world where faith does not mean a weak form of belief, faith is truth, fundamentally, Christian truth. It was a claim about Christian truth. And the opposite of religion in the 16th, 17th centuries and coming on much more recently was not the non-religious secular. It was pagan irrationality, superstition, barbaric, barbarism, and so what you have is not some dichotomy between the religious and the non-religious, but between true religion and a whole number of practices which are being discovered around the globe, which look like a kind of mistaken attempt at finding God from the point of view of the Christians. So these are superstitious practices. And what interested me, at what point did that discourse on religion as Christian truth or Protestant Christian truth become redefined as religion as a private, inner, personal practice, which is completely distinct from government? You see, the thing is that when you go back into reading these texts from the 16th and 17th century, there's no such distinction between religion and non-religion. And this is actually what the research that led up to a book I published. There were two books that I published in 2007. One was Discourse on Civility and Barbarity, a critical history of religion and related categories. And the other was an edited volume, which came out of a conference I organized at Stirling, which was called Religion and the Secular, Historical and Colonial Formations. And in that collection of essays, I published a chapter called Encompassing Religion, Privatized Religion, and the Invention of Modern Politics. And that theme, privatized religion, encompassing religion, and the invention of modern politics, is central to Discourse on Civility and Barbarity. And it represents, in some ways, a move forward from the ideology of religious studies, because it's actually looking at the historical documents that can guide us or suggest to us what were the circumstances in which somebody, i.e. someone like John Locke, who was probably the most powerful inventor of the modern religion-non-religion dichotomy, in my view. John Locke, but not only John Locke, there were plenty of others who were doing it, who were rhetorically redefining what the term religion means in order to formulate a theory of government in which government is free from the domination of religion. And that introduces many, many interesting problems, because what you have is, from the time of John Locke going into, if you like, the Enlightenment. I'm not going to leave the Enlightenment untouched by critique as a term, but for the moment, let's think of the Enlightenment in the general sense that we do typically think about it, which is a lot of men, mostly men. Didn't come across any female texts at this period, but no doubt there may have been some. But it was mostly men who wanted to have the right to accumulate private property, and for that private property to be clearly their property and not to be invaded and tampered with by the sacred monarch. We have to remember that when John Locke was writing in the 1680s and 1690s, this was a time of enormous turmoil in England. We'd had the execution of the previous king, King Charles I, in 1649. We'd had the Putney debates in the 1640s, which were very radical and which were questioning a great deal of the status quo. After the execution of Charles I in about 1652, I think it was, Hobbes published the Leviathan, And in the Leviathan, you find several references to politics, the noun word politics. And in John Locke's essays on government and his other writings, essays on toleration, for example, you get references to politics, by which he means government which is not dominated by religion and which represents the interests of male private property accumulators. And this was formulated in terms of natural rights. And there are a whole string of natural rights which were argued for. But these were really rights formulated by men, many of them nonconformists, who were chafing against the restrictions of the sacred monarch in his court and the church, the established church that legitimated the sacred monarch, performed the coronation ceremonies, gave him the legitimation to do what he liked, basically. He was an arbitrary monarch. He was portrayed as a tyrant by the people who wanted to free up government from the control of this particular ideological complex of the sacred monarch. We can call it the ancien regime to generalize it, because France was in a very similar situation where you have a closed hierarchy of classes, which is born into land ownership and born into status. And it's basically a fixed order of divine conception. And the sacred monarch is the heart of the nation. The sacred monarch is God's appointed and anointed representative on earth. So the sacred monarch had enormous powers. And there were a lot of people at this time who were nonconformist, who didn't believe in the established church and who didn't believe in the sacred monarch, though it was very dangerous to say so. Now, John Locke was one of the most powerful and influential writers to question the status quo of the time and to try and redefine what a number of terms really mean. And religion, obviously, is one of the most important. But you see, I can't find a consistent discourse on the noun word politics in English before around the middle of the 17th century. And the most consistent and developed discourse on politics that I can find is in John Locke, where he defines politics as a government not representing the arbitrary power of a sacred monarch, but government protecting the natural rights of Englishmen. And this is gendered. I mean, I'm using the expression Englishmen because women were not really much in the picture.
And it's not all men either, is it? It's the wealthy landowning classes, so it's not only gendered, but there's class in there as well.
Oh yeah, definitely. Because of course, one of the great sources, the new sources of private property at this time, was from the enclosures, and the enclosures were where legislation bills were passed in the House of Parliament, which is the legislature, in order to transform a piece of common land into private property. Now, common land was land which for centuries had been conventionally shared in ways which were determined by local customs, but there were very definite ways in which people subsisted on common land. Often a lot of the most poor people in feudal society, they were working part of the time for the local master, the local lord, but they were also working for their own subsistence, and they had common land to do this on. Now, when that common land started disappearing through the Enclosure Acts, and land that had been shared by different classes of people according to different conventions and customs, was now being enclosed and declared to be the private property of an individual. And I think this is very significant because these enclosures were continuing right the way through the 17th, the 18th, well into the 19th century. and more people were being deprived of their traditional subsistence and were being forced out into homelessness and poverty and starvation. And you get during that period, you get a growing problem of vagabondage, huge numbers of poor people who are being turned into vagabonds. And these vagabonds were despised by the owners of land because they were a living source of disharmony and conflict and discord, and they were treated really badly. There was a parish system of which was called the Poor Laws, where people without any kind of subsistence had the right to seek help from various parishes, and the parishes were supposed to give them help and food and various other necessities. That poor law system was becoming very overburdened because there were more and more poor people who were calling on it. And this created resentments from other people. So you get a very messy situation. Now, what's happening to all these vagabonds, all these poor families that are being turned off the common land, that no longer have anywhere to subsist, any land to subsist on? Well, gradually, especially during the 18th century, they're going into the new industrial centres and becoming wage labour. Before that, a lot of them were becoming wage labour, agricultural labour. There was a huge growing agricultural wage labour set. So the people who lost subsistence land were losing their conventional ties to the old estates system, the old feudal system, and were becoming like loose cannons. They didn't have any place in any kind of system or structure. So they were becoming, as it were, peas out of a pod. They were rolling around the place and looking for work, and often going into the growing craft centres, but they were also working as agricultural wage labour. So that was that was one of the processes, complex process, but a very definite process that was occurring as part of what I would describe as the emergence of modernity. And I think it's important to realize that the natural rights that these men were proclaiming, from John Locke and many others, going right the way up to the natural rights of the Declaration of Independence and the US Constitution and beyond, these natural rights were habeas corpus. You can't be arrested without being charged with some crime. You have to have access to a lawyer. You're allowed. Another right would be to express one's views in public, the right of publishing, and so on. But I think that the key right was the right to accumulate private property, and to have that private property represented in Parliament. So if you trace the way that Parliament and government changed during the second half of the 17th century, going on into the 18th, you get increasingly the idea that Parliament, the real function of Parliament, is to represent the natural inalienable rights of individual private property holders against the predations of the sacred monarch, against the invasions of a tyrant prince, against arbitrary taxation, and these kinds of things. That's really, I think,
it's not a liberty in some abstract metaphysical sense. It's the liberal order is the freedom to own property without interference from, as you say, from the divinely appointed monarch.
Yes, I think that's true. I think that was because after all, not only through the Enclosure Acts, but also in this colonial situation, which was burgeoning, more and more money could be made out of colonial production. including the slave trade. I mean, the men that we're talking about who were demanding representation in Parliament on the basis of a property qualification, these were often the same men who were not only benefiting from the enclosures, but they were also benefiting from the plantations and colonies that were being established, for example, in North America. John Locke had very specific interests in the Carolinas.
Mm-hmm.
William Penn, who was another rather like-minded nonconformist, he was a Quaker, he was the founder of Pennsylvania. Both of them were people who loved to write bills of rights. They were the inventors of bills of rights and constitutions. And their bills of rights and constitutions were actually adopted in the Americas. And what they were demanding was, again, they wanted government that represented natural rights, but particularly the natural rights of white male private property accumulators, including, of course, the slave trade. I don't think William Penn was involved in the slave trade.
No, but George Washington certainly was.
Yeah, absolutely. And so was John Locke. I mean, John Locke had investments in the Africa Corporation, whatever it was called. You had the East India Company, but there were also other companies dealing with specialized areas of trade. They were chartered, they were royal charters, but they had private investors. And I think it was the Africa Company that was very much involved in the slave trade. So, I mean, these men, people like John Locke, they were ambitious. They wanted private property, they wanted to accumulate, and they wanted representation in Parliament. I think an awful lot of the 1688 Bill of Rights and the invitation for the Protestants from Holland, William and Mary, this was all involved in consolidating this new view of Parliament. Now, you mentioned the word liberty, and that's a very important one, because liberty was a term that comes up in the Magna Carta in the 1215, and I think there was a second Magna Carta in 1225 or something. Liberty is central to the Magna Carta. But that was in a very, very different situation. The liberty that was being demanded then was the liberty of powerful nobles with their own private armies demanding liberties from the king.
Mm-hmm.
Well, in the beginning of the 17th century, Sir Edward Coke, who was a very effective jurist, he began to do a lot of work on this term liberty, and to extend its meaning in a way which became much more useful for the situation in the 17th century. And the meaning of liberty came very much to do with the liberty of being represented in Parliament, your own natural inalienable rights being represented in Parliament. Particularly, it was about property. I mean, you could call it the democratization of property, but I think it was a new system of private property whereby land became commodified in such a way that it could be bought and sold for cash. And we're talking about the land which was derived from the enclosures. We're talking about the theft of Irish Catholic lands by Cromwell, who took over he took over with him a man called Sir William Petty, who was a polymath, brilliant guy. He was good at just about everything. And he was taken over by Cromwell as the Land Surveyor General of Ireland. And he measured out a great deal of land in measured plots. He devised a method to measure plots of land so that it could easily be quantified, valued, bought and sold. And the methods that he used were actually used on a much larger scale by Thomas Jefferson in the 1780s, when they started surveying land systematically from the East Coast going right up to the Appalachians, and later it would go much further. But these are vast tracts of what they thought were empty land. Actually, they were Native American lands, but the Native Americans didn't think that any individual could own land. It was completely inconceivable to them. So these empty lands were being measured out in saleable plots by Thomas Jefferson and a whole team of land surveyors. So what you have is not only the emergence, the birth, I think, of a global private property market in land, but private property in capital. I mean, private property can take a lot of different forms. And going back again to John Locke, where John Locke was involved in the founding of the Bank of England in 1694. Mm-hmm. This seems to me to be, the founding of the Bank of England seems to me to be as important to the invention of religion in its modern dominant sense as a private personal communication with God, which has nothing to do with government.
Well, I think this is what's so fascinating about Discourse on Civility and Barbarity, particularly, is that this analysis of the historic development of, the category of religion and its others, that in fact it leads to a clearer idea of the function of this category, which is to normalize and mystify the processes of colonial and a colonial power and the power of landowners. But what's interesting is that mystification has been so successful that despite these being historically contingent and shifting and unstable and sometimes empty categories, nonetheless it makes up this contemporary episteme in which we live, and in which these ideas have become so normalized, and not only normalized and neutralized, but the actual basic organization of so many of our institutions, aspects of law and of parliament and academia and just everyday speech.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. I think that there is a process where a number of narratives, stories are being told. For example, Man in the State of Nature, which was a story told slightly differently by Hobbes, by Locke, and later by Rousseau. But Man in the State of Nature, it seems to me to be a complete fiction, but which nevertheless had great rhetorical power, because it placed, it invented a kind of an original human nature, which is of the lone individual survivor, a kind of savage survivor, using his native intelligence to accumulate everything that he needs for himself and his family. And I'm using gendered terminology because, after all, it wasn't woman in the state of nature; it was man in the state of nature. And women don't. They usually get. They usually get included in family. You can imagine this noble savage, or let's say this savage surviving through the wit of his own native intelligence and providing for his family against the competition of other individual savages who are also trying to grab what they can for their own ends. And this is a completely unrealistic picture. We know from anthropology, anthropologists who've studied, say, hunter-gatherers know that this is completely not as, as human groups survived or prospered. They didn't survive as competing individuals. But this idea of man in the state of nature puts that on the table in a powerful way. And it's aimed against other alternative versions. For example, John Locke, the first of his treatises on government is an extended critique of a man called Sir Robert Filmer, who wrote a book called Patriarchy. And patriarchy is it's actually a very powerful representation of what was considered to be an Orthodox Christian Protestant, but post-Reformation, but pre-modern, I'd say, view of the world. And basically, it's this enclosed, hierarchical, fixed system in which everybody knows their place, and the whole is harmonious as long as everybody does what they're supposed to do at whatever level of the organization they operate, whatever their status is. And the Man and the State of Nature was a deliberate attempt to subvert this idea of a harmonious, hierarchical, patriarchal society, and to introduce the idea that we're all in our real natural selves, individuals who are struggling to survive, and we do it through our own native intelligence. And those of us who have the higher intelligence will be able to accumulate more. However, the people who were in this situation at some point came to realize, and this is all so fictitious, that they needed a system of rules that protected each other's property, so that if there was any contestations over property rights, then the rules could be used to sort them out. And of course, the rules were the laws which we needed a government to represent and to enforce. So government or politics ought to be about the representation of laws that defend the various natural rights such as private property. So this is the fiction of the contract theory of government. You start with man and the state of nature. How do human beings get out of the state of nature? Why? They make a contract with a particular form of government which will look after the laws that ensure that their property is kept safe, and that whoever owns what gets their just rewards. That's a completely new. This idea of government completely dislocates the old one. I mean, it was both heretical and treasonous. And that's why John Locke and other people who argued like him had to keep escaping from England and going to Amsterdam to get free of these charges of heresy or treason. So this, what these narratives do is that they explain what the real meaning of other ideas are. Liberty, the real meaning of liberty comes through these narratives. Liberty, and the term liberal is another one that begins to crop up, which I've done quite a lot of work on. So I think that does that. Sorry, I've rather lost myself. Does that answer what you were mentioning?
Yes. Well, what I want to do now is kind of step up a level and sort of think a little more broadly about this. Kind of, we can call it like cognitive colonialism, or this modern episteme, where terms like religion, the secular, liberalism, politics, where these kind of make sense. And you've described it as these of being empty signs in an automatic signaling system. And I wondered if you would tell us a little bit what you mean by this.
Okay. Well, I mentioned to you that in the last session that I found that there was so many references for religion, so many things are religious, that the term seemed to lose any specific meaning.
Right, yeah, there's a religion of everything, right?
There's a religion of everything. So it's become the sort of generic abstraction with very problematic boundaries. It's very difficult to know what cannot be included in this term. But on the other hand, you're getting the development, at first a very minority, nonconformist idea that religion has a very specific meaning, which is that it's to do with your own inner devotion and worship and your own morality and your own concerns with the life after death. And it has to be clearly distinguished from another domain, which is about the government of this world according to laws, and particularly the defense of the private rights of individuals. So, but then at the same time, you find that all of these terms, as they get used in more and more rhetorical situations throughout the 18th century, they all develop the sense of losing their original fairly concrete meaning and becoming empty generic categories. So that today, not only do we have a religion of everything, but there's a politics of everything. So politics, it seems to me, is a noun word, which is actually invented in the second half of the 17th century to talk about a particular form of government, which was both treasonous and heretical at the time, but which has become so generic, so abstract. There's now a politics of everything. There are political systems everywhere and at all times in history. And this also leads on to the question of political economy, because, the term political economy is also around from an early time in the 17th century. By the time of Adam Smith, say, in The Wealth of Nations, which was published in 1776, political economy is itself a discourse. There is a subject called political economy, which is emerging in the 18th century. So the question of where does politics end and political economy begin becomes important. And I've done a lot of research on the history of the term political economy, and I can't find, there doesn't seem to be a solution to this. And then in the late 18th century, early 19th century, you get the term economics breaking off from political economy and becoming a subject of study in itself, a science of economics, classical economics, liberal classical economics. So economics becomes defined as its own area of expertise, but what is actually the area itself? How do we define economics and distinguishing it from political economy or simply politics? What part of economics can be distinguished from politics, and what part of politics can be distinguished from economics in modern discourse? So that was another problem. There was also, I came to realize that what was happening from the late 17th century is that a number of terms which had a kind of typical deployment were becoming abstracted and reified and turned into generic abstractions. Another was history, which I've more recently been doing a lot of work on. You get an older term, history, which had, if you like, local meanings, referred to the genealogies of kings and great events, heroes, local memory, all sorts of thing in history. But by the end of the 18th century, you've got history with a capital H emerging as a scientific study, and it's become universal history. It's the history of the world. Turgot in 1751, who was a very influential French philosopher, he developed some really interesting writing on the idea of the progress of the human mind through universal history. I mean, look how far we've come, the progress of the human mind through universal history. progress. You can't think of history without progress. The modern dominant idea of history as a professionalized academic discipline was born in conjunction with the idea of progress. Not only does history seek to find how we progressed, the routes by which humans progressed from the past into the present state of European Enlightenment, but also history comes to be a sign of progress. In other words, only Euro-Americans are advanced enough to come to realize that there is a history of the world, a universal history, which is the history of the progress of the human race up until that point in history, i.e. the leaders of this progress, the European philosophers, whether they're in France or Germany or Scotland or England or North America or wherever. So you get all of these terms which are increasingly problematic. You've got politics, religion, politics, political economy, economics, progress, history. You've also got the term modern. Well, what does modern mean? Where did it come from? You've also got the term the Enlightenment. Again, this is, I've done quite a lot of research into the concept of the Enlightenment. And what I found is that nobody can agree on when the Enlightenment began. Nobody can agree on when it ended, if it at all ended. Some people think the Enlightenment is still going on. Nobody can agree on who the most important thinkers were, which is interesting because some come straight to mind, but there's enormous disagreement among experts on that, nor on what the fundamental ideas of the Enlightenment are. In other words, all of these things are contested, but the term the Enlightenment, like the term modern, like the term progress, like the term history, like the term religion or politics or political economy, we use them as though it's obvious what they mean. So it seems to me that what's happened is that they have the rhetorical history, if you like, of these terms has progressively buried the history of conflict, contestation, the indefinability of all these terms. And they have become, as it were, just unitary signs which we can deploy automatically without thinking about their history of conflictual contestation and so on, without thinking about what they mean. We can bury a whole number of very problematic aspects of these generic categories by simply deploying them as though they're signs in an automatic signaling system. And in fact, I would go further. It seems to me that we are more operated on than operating. I mean, these signs, these general categories operate our texts. In fact, they constitute our own subjectivity to a large extent. Our idea of ourselves as being autonomous agents, which is actually a kind of feels like an inherently intuitive experience of myself as an autonomous agent. But it's very much dependent on this whole ideology that has been constructed out of these empty categories, of which the individual may be one of the most empty. So this is how I moved from talking in a kind of Dumontian sense of the configuration of modern categories. I was influenced by Durkheim's attempt to describe collective symbolic representations in his work on totemism. I've been, to a certain extent, influenced by the idea of the expression meta-categories and meta-narratives of Lyotard. I have probably been influenced largely unconsciously by semiotics deriving from Saussure, possibly Derrida, but I'm not directly indebted to them at all because I didn't come by that route. I think probably I've absorbed through the skin a great deal of the influence of these writers and thinkers. But basically, I came to this idea of signs in a signaling system through just looking at these categories and trying to work out what they are, what they mean, what their range of applications is, what their origin was, and how they were used in the origin, and how they're now used. I think does that make sense?
Very much so, and I think it's a perfect place to wrap up. I think you've summarised, and it was nice that you brought it back to where we started. Actually, that's nice. But I just want to say thanks for speaking to us today, Tim, and sharing your ideas with the RSP.
No, it's a pleasure. Thank you very much for having me, and I hope we can continue this because there's a lot more to be said.
Absolutely. I'm stopping because we've run out of time, and that's literally the only reason.
Okay.
But
that's brilliant.
We'll definitely organize another conversation soon. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much, David. Thank you. Nice to talk. Very good to hear from you.
I'm really thankful that we can bring interviews with figures in the academy who have really produced seminal work that so many of us think about and has informed our work. I'm always telling my students that categorization and how we use and deploy categories is so essential to think about. It's part of the way that I always start the classes, part of the way that I structure how I do my course design. And for you, Bree, I'm wondering how those issues play out when you do your work, because your classroom is a museum and museum patrons. So how do categories work for you? What's the central category that you have to struggle dealing with the difference between scholarly use and the legacy of where that category came from, and popular understanding or misunderstanding about categories?
Yeah, there's definitely two terms that immediately jump to mind. The first is the word the Holocaust. I mean, working in a Holocaust museum, the idea of the term Holocaust, which obviously refers in an ancient context to a burnt sacrifice, and then how that is transferred into a historical context is obviously quite complex. But the main sort of categorical issue that comes up with this term is, to whom does it refer? Does it only refer to the Jewish victims? Does it refer to other victims that were targeted? And then we fall into the category of genocide, and at what point were certain groups targeted with genocidal intent, and does that mean that they then fall into the category or the title of Holocaust? And so you have this sort of battle between who is included in this title of Holocaust and who is in, and where do you draw the line in genocide? Now, genocide, obviously, as a legal definition that came out in 1948 in the International Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide, has quite clear parameters. But how that term is then used in the media is really falls outside of those parameters. So, I mean, a key example would be the Cambodian genocide, which technically by the 1948 definition actually does not fall within the parameters, because the target group was a political group primarily. Yes, there was ethnical targetings as well, but because it was primarily a political group being targeted, it actually does not fall within the parameters of the 1948 definition. And it might surprise people to know that the Cambodian genocide was actually only referred to as such for the first time in a courtroom in 2019. That was the first time it was actually referred to as a genocide in a legal setting. So these terms, the way that they're used in a broader context as opposed to the way they're used in their respective academies, and how they're used even in a classroom context or a museum context, is it's exceedingly complex, and it's not just a religious studies issue. I mean, these ideas expand across all disciplines, really. But thinking about other disciplines, religious studies, all those sorts of things, what do we have next week, Dave?
Well, next week we have the return of our discourse episodes. Each month, we are now delighted to share a current events discussion between Religious Studies Project editors and some of our colleagues from around the world. And I can't tell you exactly what they're going to talk about because they wait until as close as they can to the publishing deadline to have the most timely and most current thing that they can discuss. And so while I can't say specifically what it's going to be, I can say that I'm really thankful that our Patreons have been able to support us in developing this work. This discourse episodes were originally for patrons only of our Patreon account, and we encourage everybody that enjoys the work that Project RS, which is what we are called on Patreon, that we do here, and supporting our ability to fund scholars when they do work for us, and to keep all of our episodes that are airing free for everyone. We'd invite you to give us $1, give us $5 if you're able to give us $10 a month. Making podcasts is not cheap. It's not free. The labor isn't free, and when we can, I know that all of us would love to support work that we share and work that we enjoy and work that's promoting interesting and valuable conversations for the field. And so next time you'll have an opportunity to hear some current events things, and we hope that will help convince you that we are worth your money and worth your time. And we are thankful for both of those things. And until then, all that's left to say is thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening.
The RSP is sponsored by the British Association for the Study of Religions, the North American Association for the Study of Religion, and the International Association for the History of Religions. The Religious Studies Project is produced by the Religious Studies Project Association, SCIO, a Scottish charitable incorporated organisation, charity number SC047750.
Brought to you by founders and editors-in-chief Chris Cotter and David Robertson, and managing editor Thomas J. Coleman III. Our features are edited by Marek Sullivan and Rebecca Barrett-Fox, and our Opportunities Digest by Ella Bock. Podcast transcription by Helen Bradstock, with audio editing by Gregory Schneider and Samuel Ward. Social media managed by Ray Radford, sales and marketing by Sammy Bishop, and video editing by Jonathan Tuckett.
Don't forget you can support the project by using our amazon.com, .co.uk and .ca links, or donating at patreon.com/projectrs, and you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Google+, YouTube, iTunes and other portals.